Welcome to Sinister Stories, where the shadows hold more than just secrets. If you're a fan of the dark and the twisted, you're in the right place. Tonight, we dive into a tale that will send chills down your spine. Before we begin, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss a single spine-tingling story. When Jack first arrived at Rig 47, he thought he'd found his golden ticket. A job paying $38 an hour, a free room, and meals included? For a man with a pile of debts back on shore, it felt too good to pass up. The offshore oil rig, located roughly 50 miles off the coast of Texas in the Gulf of Mexico, wasn't glamorous, but Jack was no stranger to hard work. The crew was a rugged bunch, some grizzled veterans who'd been on the rigs for decades, and others, like Jack, greener but desperate. His first week passed without incident, aside from the isolation gnawing at him. But on his 8th day, the rig manager, Earl, gathered the night crew together in the mess hall for a meeting. Earl cleared his throat, glancing around the room as though he were looking for ghosts. Some of you are new here, so I'll lay it out plain. Rig 47's been operational for years, but, well, some odd things have happened out here. We've got rules to keep things running smoothly. Break them and you'll regret it. The men exchanged uneasy glances, but Earl pressed on. Rule 1, he said, pacing. If you're working the night shift and hear something tapping on the windows, ignore it. Don't look. Don't acknowledge it. Just keep your head down and your focus on the job. Rule 2, always make sure the lights on the rig stay on at night. If a section goes dark, report it immediately. Rule 3, stay out of the water. No matter what you think you see or hear, don't even think about taking a dip. And Rule 4. Earl paused, his voice dropping to a near whisper. If you hear someone calling your name from outside and they shouldn't be there, don't answer. Don't go looking. Stay inside, and you'll be fine. Jack thought it was some kind of initiation joke, but the rest of the crew nodded solemnly. Nobody laughed, and Earl's tone left no room for doubt. After the meeting, Jack cornered one of the veteran crew members, Miguel, in the locker room. That was serious, wasn't it? Miguel nodded, his face pale. Dead serious, amigo. Jose didn't listen. Jack frowned. Who's Jose? Miguel sighed. He was one of us, just like you. About 2 months ago, he started saying weird things. Claimed something was out there, watching us. We all thought he was losing it. Then one night, he vanished. No body, no clue, nothing. Just gone. Gone? Jack asked, his stomach sinking. Gone, Miguel repeated, his voice like gravel. Jack tried to shake the story from his mind as he prepared for his first night shift, but the unease lingered. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the rig seemed to transform. Shadows stretched long and deep across the metal grating, and the Gulf waters glimmered like black glass. His first few hours passed uneventfully. The hum of machinery and the distant cries of seabirds filled the air. But around midnight, Jack noticed something unusual. A ripple in the water, far too large for a fish. It was subtle at first, like a shadow sliding beneath the surface. He blinked and rubbed his eyes, thinking he imagined it. Then it happened again. A massive ripple, almost like a wave, rolled away from the rig. Whatever caused it was big. Far bigger than anything Jack had ever seen in the Gulf. Hey, Miguel, Jack called over the radio. What is it? Miguel's voice crackled back. You ever see anything strange in the water out here? Jack asked, trying to keep his voice casual. There was a long pause before Miguel replied. I told you, amigo. Jose wasn't crazy. Keep your eyes on your work, and don't go looking for answers you don't want. Jack's heart pounded as he returned to his tasks. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was watching him. Around 2 a.m., the rig shuddered slightly, as if something massive had bumped against its supports. Jack froze, his wrench slipping from his grasp and clanging against the grating. He strained his ears, but all he heard was the relentless hum of the rig and the distant slosh of waves. And then came the tapping. It started faintly, like a pebble against glass, but quickly grew louder. Tap, tap, tap. Jack turned his head slowly toward the control room window. A shadow loomed just outside, its shape impossible to discern through the salt-frosted glass. Tap. Tap. He remembered Earl's warning and squeezed his eyes shut, heart hammering in his chest. "Just ignore it," he muttered under his breath. The tapping grew insistent, almost frantic, before abruptly stopping. The silence that followed was somehow worse. Jack opened his eyes, but the shadow was gone. He grabbed his radio, his hands trembling. "Miguel, something's out here." Miguel's response was grim. "Stay calm. Stick to the rules. You'll be fine." Jack didn't feel fine. As dawn broke, Jack stumbled back to his bunk, exhausted and shaken. But sleep didn't come easily. His dreams were filled with ripples in the water, shadows tapping at the glass, and Jose's voice whispering, "Something's watching us." The next night, Jack's nerves were on edge. The sunlight had barely faded before the unease set in, creeping up his spine like cold fingers. He hadn't mentioned the tapping to anyone else, but Miguel's grim demeanor confirmed that Jack wasn't the only one who felt the rig was hiding something. The crew's banter over dinner was subdued, their usual jokes replaced by furtive glances at the darkening horizon. Jack caught snippets of whispered conversations. "You think it'll happen again? Keep your head down, man. Don't invite trouble. Jose tried to warn us, remember?" By the time Jack reported to his station, the rig was wrapped in shadow, the gulf stretching endlessly in every direction. The lights buzzed faintly, casting flickering halos onto the steel grating. Jack glanced toward the water, half expecting to see the strange ripples again. And there they were. This time they were closer, just below the rig's edge. The water churned subtly like something massive was lurking just beneath the surface. Jack tightened his grip on the railing, fighting the urge to peer further into the inky depths. "Don't stare too long." Miguel's voice came from behind him, making Jack jump. The older man's face was pale, his eyes hard. "It doesn't like being watched." "What doesn't?" Jack demanded, his voice barely a whisper. Miguel hesitated, his jaw tightening. "We don't know. And we don't want to. Just follow the rules, and it'll leave you alone." Jack wanted to press for more, but Miguel had already turned and walked away. The hours dragged on. The rig seemed alive in the dark, creaking and groaning with the weight of secrets. Jack tried to focus on his tasks, but his thoughts kept drifting to the ripples and the shadow that had tapped on the window the night before. Around midnight, the rig shuddered again, more violently this time. Jack's tools rattled, and the ground beneath his feet felt unsteady. He froze, listening. A low, guttural sound echoed through the night. It wasn't the wind or the usual groan of the rig. It was deeper, more primal, like the rumble of a distant earthquake. Jack's radio crackled to life. "You feel that?" Miguel's voice asked. "Yeah," Jack replied, his throat dry. "What the hell was it?" There was a pause before Miguel answered. "It's closer tonight. Just keep your head down." Before Jack could respond, the lights on the eastern platform flickered and went out. A stretch of the rig plunged into darkness, and the uneasy feeling in Jack's gut twisted into full-blown dread. He remembered Earl's second rule: always make sure the lights stay on. Grabbing a flashlight, Jack made his way toward the darkened platform. His footsteps echoed against the metal grating, each step sounding louder in the oppressive silence. The beam of his flashlight wavered as his hands trembled. When he reached the edge of the platform, he found the fuse box hanging open, the wires inside torn apart as if by massive claws. Jack stared at the damage, his mind racing. Suddenly, a splash echoed from below. Jack's flashlight flicked to the water, catching the briefest glimpse of movement, something enormous slipping beneath the surface. His heart pounded as he staggered back from the edge. The radio crackled again. "Get back inside," Miguel barked. Jack didn't need to be told twice. He turned and bolted, his footsteps frantic against the grating. As he ran, he heard it, a sound that made his blood run cold. It was his name. "Jack." The voice was faint, carried on the wind. It sounded familiar, almost like Jose's. "Jack, help me." Against every instinct, Jack slowed, glancing over his shoulder. There was no one there. just the empty platform and the dark expanse of water beyond it. "Jack," the voice called again, this time more insistent. It was coming from the direction of the water. Jack froze, his breath catching in his throat. Earl's fourth rule echoed in his mind. If you hear someone calling your name from outside, don't answer. Don't go looking. His flashlight flickered, plunging the platform into brief darkness. When the beam returned, Jack saw something that made his knees buckle. A figure was standing on the edge of the platform, silhouetted against the moonlit water. It looked like Jose, his clothes tattered and soaked, his face pale and hollow. "Jack," the figure whispered, extending a trembling hand. Jack stumbled back, his pulse racing. "You're not real," he muttered, his voice shaking. The figure took a step closer. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, as though it were a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. "Help me," it said again, its voice cracking. Jack turned and ran, not stopping until he was back in the safety of the rig's main control room. He slammed the door shut behind him, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. Miguel was waiting for him, his face grim. "You saw it, didn't you?" Jack nodded, unable to speak. Miguel placed a hand on his shoulder. "It's not Jose, Jack. Whatever's out there, it's not human." The two men sat in silence, the weight of the rig's unspoken horrors pressing down on them. Outside, the water rippled again, and the low, guttural sound echoed through the night. Jack couldn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the figure, its empty gaze and unnatural movements. He replayed the scene over and over, his mind searching for an explanation. Was it a hallucination? Stress? Or was there truly something lurking out there, mocking Jose's memory? The morning came, but the daylight brought little comfort. Miguel sat across from Jack in the break room, his coffee untouched. The other crew members avoided eye contact, their conversations hushed. Earl entered, his boots clanging against the grating. He stopped in the middle of the room, his expression unreadable. "Crew meeting," he announced. "Now." The men gathered around as Earl began. "We've had another incident," he said, his voice tight. "Jack saw something last night." All eyes turned to Jack. He shifted uncomfortably under their scrutiny, but nodded. "It looked like Jose," he said. "But it wasn't right." The room fell silent. Earl's jaw tightened, and he folded his arms. "This isn't the first time something like this has happened. It won't be the last. You all know the rules. You follow them, you stay alive. End of story." "What is it?" one of the younger crew members asked. "Out there, I mean. What are we dealing with?" Earl's eyes hardened. "We don't know, and you don't want to find out." Miguel stepped forward, his voice steady. "We've all seen the signs, the ripples, the shadows, the whispers. It's been watching us ever since Jose disappeared, maybe even before." Jack's stomach churned. "You mean this has been going on for a while?" Miguel nodded. "Years, Jack. There's always something in the Gulf. Something old, something hungry." The crew dispersed after the meeting, but the unease lingered like a storm cloud. Jack spent the day inspecting equipment and trying to distract himself, but the strange occurrences weighed heavy on his mind. That evening, the sky turned an ominous shade of gray, and the wind picked up. The rig swayed slightly, its towering structure creaking under the force of the waves. Earl's warning echoed in Jack's mind. Follow the rules, and you stay alive. As night fell, Jack found himself assigned to inspect the eastern platform, the same one where he'd seen the figure. He hesitated, but Earl's stern gaze left no room for argument. The platform was eerily quiet, the only sounds the faint lapping of waves and the occasional groan of the rig. Jack worked quickly, his flashlight sweeping over pipes and valves. Then he heard it. A splash, louder this time, followed by a deep, resonant sound that vibrated in his chest. Jack froze, his heart pounding. Slowly, he turned his flashlight toward the water. The beam caught movement, something massive just beneath the surface. The water churned violently, as if the ocean itself was alive. Jack stumbled back, nearly dropping his flashlight. The ripples grew larger, converging toward the platform, and then he saw it. A shape began to rise from the water, black and featureless against the dim light of the rig. It wasn't a fish or a whale. Its form was too alien, too unnatural. The surface of its skin glistened like oil, and its outline shifted as though it were made of smoke and shadows. Jack's mind screamed at him to run, but his feet were rooted to the spot. The creature loomed closer, its amorphous body undulating as it reached the edge of the platform. "Jack." The voice was there again, more distinct this time. It wasn't just Jose's voice. It was layered with others, a chorus of desperate whispers. "Come to us." Jack snapped out of his trance and bolted back toward the rig's main structure. Behind him, the platform shuddered as the creature's weight pressed against it. He didn't stop until he was inside, slamming the door shut and locking it. His chest heaved as he struggled to catch his breath. Miguel found him minutes later, pale and shaking. "What did you see?" Jack shook his head, unable to put it into words. "That bad?" Miguel asked. "It's real," Jack whispered. "Whatever it is, it's real." Miguel placed a hand on Jack's shoulder. "You're starting to understand now. This place, it's not just an oil rig. It's a feeding ground." Jack stared at him, his mind reeling. Feeding ground? For what? Miguel didn't answer. He didn't need to. That night, Jack stayed in the control room, unable to sleep. He watched the monitors, his eyes scanning for any signs of the creature. The rig creaked and groaned, its structure seeming more fragile than ever. Around 3 a.m., the alarms blared. Jack's heart leapt as he checked the screens. One of the cameras on the western platform had gone dark, its feed replaced by static. Another camera showed the water roiling violently, the ripples converging toward the rig. Earl's voice crackled over the intercom. "Everyone stay inside. Do not go out under any circumstances." Jack gripped the edge of the console, his knuckles white. Outside, the rig swayed violently, and the deep guttural sound echoed through the night once more. It was closer now. The rig trembled beneath Jack's boots, the alarms blaring a warning that felt more primal than mechanical. Each vibration resonated with the deep, guttural sound from the ocean. Miguel burst into the control room, his face pale and drenched with sweat. "We've got movement on the eastern platform," he said, pointing to the monitor. "It's back." Jack glanced at the screen. The camera feed was barely functional, distorted with static, but he could make out ripples spreading across the water's surface like fingers reaching for the rig. "What do we do?" Jack asked, his voice strained. "We follow the rules," Miguel replied. "It's the only way." Earl's voice crackled through the intercom again. "All crew members are to remain inside. Lock the hatches. No exceptions." Jack's gaze shifted to the laminated list of rules pinned to the wall. One stood out like a beacon. Rule number 5. If you hear the alarms after 3 a.m., do not respond to any voices outside, no matter who they belong to. Jack shivered. The memory of Jose's distorted figure on the platform played in his mind. Miguel paced the room. "It wants us to break the rules. That's how it gets you." A sudden metallic groan echoed through the rig. The sound was deafening, like the structure itself was crying out in pain. Jack glanced at the monitor and froze. The shadow had returned, rising higher than before. It was clearer now, its form constantly shifting like liquid smoke. What terrified Jack the most were its eyes, 2 faint glowing orbs that seemed to pierce the camera lens and lock onto him. "It's watching us," Jack muttered. Miguel nodded grimly. "It always does." Another alarm blared, and the door to the control room rattled violently. Jack and Miguel jumped, their eyes snapping to the door. "Open up!" a voice shouted. "It's me, Jose!" Jack's blood ran cold. The voice was eerily accurate, Jose's tone, his cadence, but something was wrong. It was too clear, too perfect, as though it were an imitation. Miguel stepped back, shaking his head. "Don't open it," he whispered. "It's not him." The banging grew louder. "Please, let me in. It's out here. I need your help." Jack's hands clenched into fists. The voice tugged at his guilt, his memories of Jose. What if it was him? What if he was still alive out there, trapped in the creature's grip? Miguel grabbed Jack's arm, his grip firm. "That's not Jose," he said. You know it isn't. Jack hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to help his friend. But deep down, he knew Miguel was right. The banging stopped suddenly, and the silence that followed was even worse. Jack stared at the door, his heart pounding. Then came the whisper. Jack, you can't leave me out here. It was Jose's voice, but softer now, almost pleading. Jack clenched his jaw, fighting the urge to respond. Miguel leaned in close. Focus on the rules. Stay alive. That's all that matters. The whisper continued, growing fainter, as though Jose, or whatever was imitating him, was being dragged away. Jack forced himself to look at the monitor again. The shadow was gone. For a moment, Jack felt a flicker of relief, but then the alarms blared again, and the rig shuddered violently. The water around the structure churned as if the ocean itself was rebelling. What's it doing? Jack asked, his voice trembling. Miguel's face was pale. It's testing us. Suddenly, another camera feed went dark, then another. Jack's stomach dropped as he realized the creature was circling the rig, systematically cutting them off from the outside world. Earl! Jack shouted into the intercom. We're losing cameras, what do we do? There was no response. Miguel grabbed a wrench from a nearby table. We need to get to the emergency power room. If it cuts the main feed, we're blind. Jack hesitated. Leave the control room? Are you crazy? The rules! Miguel's expression was grim. The rules keep us alive, but if we can't see it coming, we're sitting ducks. Reluctantly, Jack followed Miguel out of the room, the wrench clutched tightly in his hand. The corridors were eerily quiet, the usual hum of machinery drowned out by the groaning of the rig. As they moved deeper into the structure, the air grew colder. Jack shivered, his breath visible in the dim light. It's close, Miguel whispered. The two men reached the emergency power room, a small reinforced chamber filled with humming equipment. Miguel began working on the backup system while Jack kept watch, his eyes darting to every shadow. Then he heard it. A low, guttural growl resonating through the walls. Jack's grip on the wrench tightened as he scanned the room. Miguel, hurry! He hissed. I'm trying, Miguel replied, his voice tense. The growl grew louder, followed by the sound of metal scraping against metal. Jack turned toward the door, his heart racing, and then for the first time he saw it clearly. The creature's form filled the doorway, its amorphous body writhing as if it were made of living tar. The glowing orbs that served as its eyes fixed on Jack, and he felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Miguel. Jack's voice was barely a whisper. I got it, Miguel shouted, flipping a switch. The backup lights flickered on, bathing the room in a harsh white glow. The creature recoiled, its body convulsing as if the light burned it. With a final, deafening roar, it retreated into the shadows. Jack and Miguel stood in stunned silence, their breaths ragged. It's not over, Miguel said finally. It's never over. The lights flickered ominously, casting long, trembling shadows on the walls. Jack and Miguel stood frozen in the emergency power room, the creature's retreat still fresh in their minds. It's coming back, Miguel said, his voice barely audible. They always do. Jack clenched the wrench tighter, his knuckles white. What do you mean, they? You've seen more than one? Miguel hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. There's more than one out there. Jose, he saw them first. He tried to warn us, but none of us listened. And then, a sudden crash echoed from the corridor, cutting him off. Both men turned toward the door, the sound of heavy, wet footsteps growing louder. Miguel's eyes widened. We need to get back to the control room. Now. Jack nodded, but his legs felt like lead. The air around them seemed to grow heavier with every step they took, as if the rig itself were trying to trap them. The two moved cautiously through the narrow passageways, their breaths shallow. The creature's presence was palpable, its guttural growls reverberating through the walls. As they neared the control room, a chilling realization dawned on Jack. The rules weren't just about survival, they were about containment. The creature wasn't trying to break in. It was trying to break free. Miguel, Jack whispered. If there's more than one, what's stopping them from coming all at once? Miguel swallowed hard. The rig. It's like a barrier. Something about the machinery, the lights. It keeps them at bay. But if we don't follow the rules, we weaken that barrier. Jack's mind raced, connecting the dots. The alarms, the cameras, the hatches. It was all part of a delicate balance, and they were losing it. They reached the control room just as the rig shuddered violently. Jack slammed the door shut and locked it, his heart pounding. Miguel rushed to the monitors, his hands trembling as he scanned the feeds. "What's happening?" Jack demanded. Miguel pointed to the screen. The cameras that were still functional showed the water surrounding the rig churning violently. Shadows moved beneath the surface, circling like predators. "They're converging," Miguel said. "We're running out of time." Earl's voice crackled through the intercom. "Crew, this is your final warning. Follow the last rule. Do not break the circle." Jack's stomach dropped. "What circle?" Miguel froze, his face draining of color. "The maintenance ring," he whispered. "It's a safety measure, a boundary. If it breaks..." Another crash rocked the rig and the lights flickered. Jack grabbed the intercom. "Earl, what do we do?" There was no response. Miguel grabbed a flashlight and a toolkit. "We have to check the ring. If it's damaged, we're dead." Jack hesitated. Every instinct told him to stay in the control room, to lock the door and pray for morning. But he knew Miguel was right. "Let's go," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. The maintenance ring was a series of reinforced metal panels encircling the base of the rig. It was designed to contain oil spills, but now Jack realized it served a far more sinister purpose. As they descended to the lower decks, the rig groaned under the strain of the storm. Water seeped through the walls, cold and briny, as if the ocean itself was reaching for them. Miguel led the way, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. They reached the maintenance hatch and stepped onto the platform. The wind howled around them and the waves crashed violently against the rig's supports. "There!" Miguel shouted, pointing to a section of the ring. One of the panels was missing, torn away as if by an enormous force. Jack's heart sank. The gap in the circle was like an open wound, and the shadows in the water seemed to gather around it, drawn to the weakness. "We need to fix it," Miguel said, pulling out the tools. Jack held the flashlight steady as Miguel worked, his hands fumbling with the bolts. The creature's growls grew louder, and Jack felt its gaze on him, heavy and suffocating. "Hurry," Jack urged. Miguel secured the final bolt just as a massive shadow rose from the water. Jack turned to face it, his body trembling with fear. The creature loomed over them, its form even more grotesque in the dim light. Its eyes burned like twin suns, and its body writhed with unnatural movements. "We're too late," Miguel whispered. The creature lunged, its amorphous body stretching toward them. Jack grabbed the wrench and swung with all his might, the metal connecting with a sickening thud. "Go!" Miguel shouted, pulling Jack toward the hatch. They scrambled inside, slamming the door shut just as the creature's tendrils slammed against it. The rig trembled, and Jack braced himself for the worst. But then, the growls subsided. The rig stopped shaking. Jack and Miguel sat in stunned silence, their breaths ragged. Did we stop it?" Jack asked. Miguel nodded slowly. "For now, but it'll come back. It always does." Jack stared at the control panel, the rules etched into his mind. He had survived the night, but he knew the fight was far from over. As the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, Jack made a silent vow. He would uncover the truth about the rig, the creatures, and the rules that kept them alive.